this evening we thought we would talk through some of the key concepts underscoring Daniel's practice, and then we'll turn towards the piece that we saw on Saturday. And we'll start with some earlier works and then look at some of the works that really include participants and that are more performative. So we'll start really at the beginning. And so here we have a slide of the Saint-Pierre textile market where in September 1965 you came across linens that were woven and had these stripes, a colored stripe followed by a white and so forth. And these stripes really became your signature motif. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you were making prior to this moment, prior to this discovery?
Briefly, yes. I was doing what we can call, with no problem, paintings. And I was trying also to do something extremely, let's say, reduce, extremely unpersonal, banal, etc., etc. And I was also, for different reasons, I was trying to make, for example, the canvas as unexpressive as possible. And for that, I worked a lot with masking tapes, which was covering the linen or the cotton. And then I was painting on top of that. And then I take out the tapes, and the canvas on which I was working, usually at that time they were bed sheets with coloring like pink and blue, green, etc., come back to the viewer. What was paint was going normally as flat as possible. And I worked like that for a full year in the year 65. And I was working at that time in a very special place, which was St. Croix in the Virgin Island, in the US Virgin Island. And with the material was almost non-existent. That's the reason I painted on bed sheet. That was the only material big enough for what I wanted to do. And when I did a trip in the middle, a little more in the middle of my stay for 1 year in this place, I was looking for material, and then I get to that place in Paris, which is the best and the biggest shop for all sort of linens, and looking for, let's say, a white kind of material. Walking, I found this striped material, and all of a sudden I realized that that was much better than what I was doing. And so I immediately bought like 10 meters or something like that, and I get back to the island, and I continue to work instead of this colored bed sheet and canvas. I use this material, and I start to work with that at the end of 1965, and after that I developed a lot of things, but from this unique material, which is unique to a certain point, but the most existing in the entire world. This kind of material, you can find it anywhere.
And so we have some examples of those earlier works before you were altering the ready-made material. So here we have untitled works from 65 that were made on the bed sheets. And you were using boat paint. So you're really using the materials that you...
Which was really very available there. And so what I said, you can really see it in this image. What is a little darker, this is what was behind the masking tape, and the rest was the thing painted on top. So this when you clean the masking tape, you were having something regular coming to the surface. And my attempt was to do something with almost no pictoriality. Of course, I was totally wrong, but that's what I was trying to do.
So we have this one and then also this example, but some of them are very flat, and then there are a few others where you were experimenting with shaping the canvas, which you can see in this piece here.
Yeah, that's coming with other material during the same trip. I found also this material. I was interested. They were in fact much closer to what I was doing with paint. And then I did the work with a piece of steel with no form, I mean not regular form and not geometrical, on which I just put this piece of linen, making that shape by itself. So that was another direction which I did not follow too long, but which I was interested to work with.
So September '65 is the time when you came across the textiles at the market, and in the collection here at the Walker we have a 1966 work, which you can see in this image here. And what you were doing is, in this particular work, there is a pre-existing fabric which then you painted in what you frequently described as a dull white acrylic paint on the side, these wavy lines.
So it was a lot of, let's say, experimentation with this linen as a background. So the very first, after quitting more or less with a little more regular painting, was still using the big shapes and using the existing background much more than with the stripes when I use the masking tape. And little by little, I reduce this kind of activity on top of the linen. And this was more or less close to the end of this work, where I was only using the extreme colored stripes and over painted with acrylic white. And the step after was, of course, not to use anymore the covering of the colored stripe, but the white one. So it was less and less visible as where the paint was applied. But I just want to say that for me the way, even if it was reduced to this extreme, of the fact of painting on top of it was extremely important, because it was a way to more or less open a door to any kind of discussion based on painting, for example, instead of opening the door to a discussion with ready-made. And if it was not paint at all and just a use of the material, I was having strictly no interest even to show that material.
Right. And so these works are really often described in terms of distilling painting to its 0 degree. How can you unpack that?
I think it was really the attempt to get to this philosophical situation where we already knew a little bit some approach in the philosophical world with Roland Barthes, for example, writing about the degré zero, 0 degree of writing. And I think that was an attempt of the 0 degree of painting, with what was given to see, what supposedly, let's say, essential, but nothing more, nothing less. You can see where it's painted, you can see what is painted, you can see where is the paint, where is the support, and more or less that was the almost the achievement of that goal.
Yeah, you said this previously, that as you look at this work, it's a work of which nothing can be said except that it is. So it's really presenting the very bare facts of how the painting came into being?
That was really strong in my wishes to try to reduce, not to say to reduce the painting to make something, how to say, not painting, but to have nothing foreign to the element of painting in a very drastic way, which I pushed even further, because to make one of this work can be just like a manifesto, but I wanted to even break that, and for more than a year I did only works like that. So in a way they were repeating the same situation, except the linen was not having the same color, but all the rest, and maybe not the same shape, where I was using usually big shapes like this one, like 2 by 2 or a little more, or 150 by 160. So it was never very small.
But always the same orientation.
Same orientation, always vertical and repeating itself as a kind of hygienic, process to work. And that was what I produced for, all the year, end of 67 and 68. More or less in balance with another type of work.
Sure. So that's interesting also because there's a leap from the stripes being on a ready-made linen that you purchased and then altered, but then the stripes immediately at that same time were also becoming part of your vocabulary, and you can see that in this particular piece, which are the works that you realized in 1968 in Paris. So I wonder if maybe we could talk about this work and how it illustrates the notion of a work in situ, which is how you describe your works.
I think that the work we just saw before, and like the big canvas, was a turning point in many ways. In fact, at the very same time, I decided, after thinking about the problem, of course, but let's say I decided most of the same time to quit any idea as to look for a studio. So I was having up to there small places where I was working, big difficulty to find anything bigger and even to pay for something. And then I get to this very simple question, but why an artist need a studio? Which seems to be completely simple, but in fact you realize that it's almost not existing to have a painter or a sculptor without a space to work. So I quit with the studio, and I quit with the linen, and I start to think, of course, automatically, you don't have a studio whatsoever. Where can you work? I mean, and I wanted to produce certain things. So the first solution, living in Paris, which I found was absolutely fantastic to do that, was to use the city as a place to work with a very old tradition, at least at that period in France, where the walls were often used by people to do posters, to make political statements, etc., etc. So I immediately thought to use that as a possibility to work, and I get to print a paper. And of course, having worked since more or less 2 years with this striped linen, I automatically thought, why to look to something else? I will just have the printing of the same vertical stripes. So they were printed on paper, and then I start to go outside in the street with my paper, my little bucket and the brush, and I cover many walls and billboards and things like that in the city. And that brings me more or less to the May 68 events, where everything was taken in the street, and where, of course, I stopped to do that at least for several months.
And you controlled the way that people found out about these through the publication of photographs. There was a little announcement, though without your name, in one of the newspapers at the time. So there was a kind of spreading of rumors.
Very little at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I took, or a friend of mine took pictures, and to have it, to be able to see it, not knowing exactly what to do with that. After that, I decided what to do, and it was, of course, it's very important, done with no permission and with no announcement, nothing at all. Knowing that many people were able to see, but more directly, having no idea of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I always refuse, that's another detail, but I always refuse, even later on, to try to make some recording or to ask the people, what do you think, what did you see, whatsoever, etc., knowing that as soon as you make that gesture, you kill absolutely the work.
Right.
And so I always was, when I do, or still more rarely I must say, but when I do anything like that, it has to keep the kind of complete anonymous situation. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, with the time, and you will immediately realize, I cannot do it because more people today, for example, in Paris or some other cities, will say, oh, maybe it's the work of this guy who is using stripes all the time. So it's finished.
I think in Paris
I cannot do it anymore.
And so Work in Situ really emphasizes the very ephemeral nature that these works have. They're rooted in a particular moment in time.
That's true, and it's opened two very new aspects for me. It was the importance of the location, mm-hmm. and I think that is even stronger than the use of the stripes. The most interesting thing I found in quitting with the studio and making my work wherever it was possible, and at the very first time where I was living. And I kept very strongly this idea, which few years later, I called more or less systematically work in situ, which was not used at all in the art world, which is also something funny to see, because today it's almost like a genre in this art world. Mm-hmm. And as you know, in situ, it's part of the French language, but it's not so much, was not at all so much used in other languages. So today, it's much everyone, even here or in English-speaking place, will immediately understand more or less the term in situ.
And you've referred to the stripes also in a very kind of direct technical way as visual tools. And you've said that the visual tool is no longer a work to be seen or to be beheld, but it is the element that permits you to see or behold something else. So throughout these works that we're talking about, really the stripes are pointing outwards, drawing your attention to what's around you.
I think, for example, just to see from this picture, the immediate thing which happened when I first start to put these stripes anywhere, most of the time on billboard, because that was a little more clean than the wall. And also I was not so much a fanatic of publicity, so it was for me even a nice gesture to block the publicity in a way or another. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, you cannot, from even these few words, you can already see that it's a lot of way to read such a thing. So if you still keep, and at that time the majority of people were just looking to work like that, if you realize that was, first of all, very, very, very few people realize that can be any kind of thing of any interest first, and certainly not a work of art. To me too, I mean, I never claimed that what I was doing there was an artwork. It's just something, it's an activity. But then to declare it's an artwork, I always said if that is declared like that one day, it will be done by the society, not by myself. I cannot be the one to declare what I do, it's art. I never understood that situation and I never did it. So you have a lot of reading if you take a little attention, and this reading as where these stripes are glued. What do they cover? What do we see? And little by little, you come to the environment, to the architecture, to the society, to the people around, etc., etc. So in one very simple gesture, you already touch more or less of hundreds of things which are part of the location. And for me at that time, and it's still something I am very interested, to physically enlarge the way to see. When I was thinking in my first big critique about painting or art in general, that a painting forces you to look like that, and I was interested to show something you have to look like that. So all the boundary you can see with your own sight being part of what is transformed, what is given, what is to be experimented.
And so there are a number of works also which require participants or performers. And so we have some slides of those. We have the Sandwich Men here, which is from 1968. We also have from the 70s the Seven Ballet in Manhattan, in which choreographed placard carrying performers were walking around in a specific choreography in different parts of Manhattan. There's also the superimposed colors, a stage piece. There's also Le Gilet, the vests, which you created for museum guards. So I wonder if maybe, and of course the piece that we saw last Saturday, I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit, I wonder if you're comfortable with the term performative or...
Okay, it's easy at least to connect with an existing way to act in the field of visual art. First of all, for example, for the very first piece I did like that with the Sandwich Man, I just have to say that the Sandwich Man was something visible in Paris almost everywhere, and so far since maybe the revolution. So it was a very funny thing for publicity, and usually they were showing either the publicity for a restaurant or for a play when they were walking in a restaurant street or in a place where having some theater, etc. And when you see the picture, and especially for people who are not Parisian, it looks also pretty strange. In fact, it was very banal. But right after that, which was after more or less May, October 68, these people and this activity completely disappear. So it doesn't exist anymore in Paris. And just to make the last comment, for that reason, even if I was interested, it's something I cannot do because it will look completely funny, completely
nostalgic.
Or nostalgic or whatsoever, nostalgic for the people who will remember, or a little spectacular for the one who have no idea the thing was really part of the Parisian streets. And that has to do with a lot of things of my work. And if I redid more or less the same idea, a little more, let's say, design or complex with ballet in Manhattan, I used something which was then everywhere, and it's still everywhere in America, which are the picket sign. And so the picket sign are used for a very different thing, but as a common thing visible by anyone in the city, you have a reference which is not something immediately extravagant. And everything maybe start to open question when you look to the picket sign, and like for the sandwich man, you see absolutely no notification. You don't know. It's not a publicity. It's not the name of some product. It's not like a restaurant. And so when the people did work with me for that, I always told them that to never answer to the people, except to say, for example, if they said, but what are you doing? What are you showing or whatsoever? To say, we are showing white and red stripes. And that's all.
And so some of these have been presented again. So, for example, this piece has been shown in London.
Yes.
And then
and also in place where the picket signs are used for specific, normally for big or small strikes, but they are used. So it's not like an object which is completely extravagant inside the environment.
Mm-hmm. And so with this is a photo that we have of Voile, Toile, 12 Voile from 2005. And originally this piece was made in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
It was presented in Berlin. It was also not very windy that day when you showed it first. And so you spoke of this piece as a work to be played and replayed, as one might say of a musical piece. And in this work we have a sailboat with striped sails. There's a regatta. The sails are hung in the order in which who arrives in the race. How did the idea for this piece begin?
I mean, the idea start with I was doing many works questioning when I was having the possibility to be, let's say, invited with a museum or a gallery. I was more or less systematically at that time, but I still do that as well or as soon as I can work with this situation to play and reveal strongly possible difference between inside and outside. So I was invited in Berlin. It was during a grant there in the early 70s. And the people who were invited for 1 year to that grant, they were also invited to do something with a museum. And so I also learned when I was there that Berlin was the biggest place for sale in all Germany. The lakes are very big, but that was also used a lot because, of course, the people living at that time in Berlin, they were more or less trapped, and that was a fantastic way to get to escape to the city. Anyhow, so when I learned that, I realized that we maybe can do something. I was interested, and that's more or less what we did here, which was some work, I must say, extremely didactic. So it's not maybe the thing I like the most in that work, but let's say at that time it was very strong to make that possible to be understood by people. So the first step is to do a regatta. And to make that regatta possible, it was to be completely in connection with a nautic club, to know how this thing works. And we used from the beginning small boats, which finally I learned was also one of the most common boats for learning how to sail in the world, not only in Berlin. And then we did special sails to fit with that boat. And the sails, as you can see, was totally striped. So that was the first step. And the second step was to dismantle everything and to make, in one way or another, all these sails in a very precise place, so-called a museum. And of course, what was more or less under this idea was when you really see the regatta, even you have the people from the nautic club. For them, it's one of the activities, they know it, etc. They invite their friends, etc. And we were invited also people from the art world. But in all the cases, everyone is looking to a very funny regatta because it's done by very small kids, and it's a race, and it's a first, a second, a third, etc., etc. As soon as you do, like a week later or a few days later, the exhibition with an invitation for the exhibition, where you show in one of the rooms the 9 sails, especially if you see the shape, it's a very special shape. It's not like a shape really looking like a sail for a boat, like, for example, the one we used 2 days ago in the lake here in Minneapolis. The shape being like a shape canvas, as soon as it's installed in the wall of the museum, look, except for the specialists, like more or less a painting, something installed on the wall, in which we also knows by the even recent art history as a shape of a painting which can exist, and we have some very good, strong artists who work like that and make that as a possible shape as much as a square or rectangle. So these two things, and I think, of course, the interest is to see and to understand the two aspects. But at that time, I think today it's a little not as strong, but at that time it was really to see how the context and the environment make the very same object readable completely differently. And I think it's always working, except with that, that's the reason I said it's a little didactic, it's really too extreme to play in two different places with the same elements.
So there's also a slight difference. I mean, you mentioned these are for the Optimus boats, so they're single sail. The sails that we have here are double, so we have a main and a jib sail. But there are slight differences. So with the original work from 1975, you had painted the edges with white acrylic paint, just like in the work that we have here in the collection. And so with the title, sail canvas, canvas sail, there's a greater proximity to the history of painting. And here, these are completely fabricated by sail companies. So I wonder if the work that we have here, how does that sit in regard to painting?
I mean, the main difference is always like something for me important, but almost difficult to be so impressed by it. The fact is, the sail we did in Berlin were with pieces of nylon put all together, and so fabricated that way, and also so mechanical that I wanted, like for the work with linen, to make it a little more, if you start to see it, because it's very, very difficult to see, like a painting, which was even much visible when you put that in the museum. But on the sea, on the water, on the lake, etc., these details was totally not visible. The sail itself was really visible. Here, we changed completely the way to do it, and in fact, the paint is already there because it's a complete serigraphy with the ink and the color, etc., etc. So it's a choice of color, and all the aspect of painting, it's done by the manufacturer itself. So to redo something will be completely not necessary.
And it's a very versatile piece, so that we have it right now in the pavilion. But in the future, when we do another regatta and when we show the work again, we can show it inside. And so again, the context will shift.
Will change completely. And I think this is really part of this kind of work. The regatta, by definition, is never the same, because it's like to a theater play if you want, but even it's like real life. So Regatta will have this little funny aspect, or it will be raining, or it's no wind, or whatsoever. So it's always very, very special. Yeah. But inside the institution, it's become to be much more stable, and then open another type of discussion. So, and then it's really many, many ways. We did the first regatta in like 17 different lakes or the sea, etc. And I never make the same way the installation of the sail after the regatta. And I know, so it's a lot of possibilities. And here we start with this kind of great pavilion in the sculpture garden, so it's not yet finished, but
almost there. And so we're going to open up to questions soon, but I'm going to ask a difficult question. But you have said in the past, every act is political, and whether one is conscious of it or not, the presentation of one's work is no exception. Any production, any work of art is social and has a political significance. You mentioned the circumstances, for example, when you did the posters in 1968, the circumstances of what Paris was like at that particular moment. So I wonder, given where we are today as a society and politically, what are the political implications for art at this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I think it's important to catch when I said that a very long time ago, but I still think the same way. My way of thinking is when an artist, any person who do something like write a book or play music or etc., not only in the visual art, but as soon as you dare to present, even if it's totally anonymous, like when I started to work, or a fortiori when it's official with a gallery, a museum, etc., as soon as you dare to show what you are producing, what you show is political. And I think, even after so many years, I still don't see how such a thing can escape of what is given to be seen. So, to just take care, and when I said every work publicly presented is political, it's not because the one who does it has a flag to say he's from this party or against this one. It's in a very general way, and of course the implication is the fact that if you dare to do that, you dare also to share or to take position about what is the society in which we are living. And that can touch as well the people who absolutely have the feeling to be not political and not care at all about these problems, as well as the one who are extremely visibly making like what they are doing, like a political thing, like a visual position against that or for this, etc., during the event of everyday life. But from my position, it's absolutely wide. And what I said at this time, in fact, which I think is a balance about the fact to say every works which is presented and to reduce it to art, every work of art is political. I add at that time, and I will dare to do it again, thinking of that, most of the production of art is completely reactionary. Then you just have to
good note to end on. I wonder if there are any questions. There's someone with a microphone there in the back. If there are any questions. So there's a question in the front here.
Thank you, but I feel like before I ask a question, you got to follow up because that's a very bold statement, and we're curious what that implies. All art being reactionary, but maybe that's the way to lead into a question, because what I'd like to ask you about is you as a person, how you could hold to your concept, work after work, year after year, decade after decade. It seems like. As far as I know, unprecedented in a way in the art world, as far as holding to a specific manifestation of a practice. And I understand that of course, the context becomes different, the environment becomes different, but it's astounding. What does that say about you as a person and as an artist? How can you possibly? Are you not tempted to just build off of that or change it and please reveal more of that part of yourself.
I think it's true for absolutely everyone. To do something, it's also to get involved in an activity where, in fact, at least for myself, this activity, it's always more or less opening something else to continue. So when you look back to the work, for example, someone even can think it's a program and it's just done piece by piece, etc. This is totally wrong. It's no program at all. And it's by the fact that, for example, a new work can open the door to something I was not thinking between doing this work. And in this relation, the fact of working as close and as conscious to where the work is done, it's at the first glance, it's extremely reductive. But in the reality, it's extremely open because the location, the place, and when I said location, place, we can think and immediately visualize architecture, environment, even if it's more the nature than the city or whatsoever. But then it's absolutely as important, sometimes more important, it's also the people you work with who push you to something else you were not thinking after a discussion, give you ideas of something you were not thinking. And this is a continual kind of, as well, a ping pong, and to launch things somewhere where you try to even go or to see how what you were thinking before might be changed because of this new environment, including the people, the place, the architecture, etc., etc. So it's much more restrictive in terms of fluidities of the objects, of course, because you cannot transport what I did, for example, in the Palais Royal, right here in front of the museum, so it's finished. So compared to a sculpture, even heavy, or a painting, it's a big handicap. The fluidity of these objects is not there. But then the possibility of these possible objects to be different from one to another, it's also extremely open because of the virtue of the site.
Thank you. Were you financially well supported when you started doing those walls in Paris in the 60s?
Were you financially well supported?
You know, I was having very little money. I was also working in different situation to make some money, very little, but to make some. And also, this is certainly also one of the reasons I use very, very cheap material. So, to print the paper and to be able to cover hundreds of meters square, to do not say thousands of meters square, cost, if you speak in terms of how much it costs to do that, was very, very, very low. And it's, in a way or another, something I kept in mind working and developing the work. So, of course, I get to certain proposition or exposition which were costing some money, usually paid by the people who invite me. But at the beginning, I really worked with something I was able to maintain and to pay by myself, like everything I did outdoor without galleries or museum, were done with almost never with any sponsoring. I have one or two very specific examples, like some friends of mine in California helped me to make 2 or 3 works in Los Angeles, one on the bus benches in 1970 already, and I redo it 3 or 4 times. Another time they helped me to make a huge billboard in the heart of Los Angeles, and I worked there for almost 1 month. So I have very, very few examples like that, but even to do that, the production cost was very, very low. The energy to do it or to be helped to do it is much bigger than the cost of the work.
There's another question here in the front.
Thank you for the really interesting talk. I come from the world of the textile industry. I used to be a textile designer. And as such, I can understand pretty well why a person would dedicate his life to stripes. And more stripes, and even more stripes, more or less same proportion. I can understand it really, really well. But then I'm really interested to listen to an artist who is supposedly not connected to the industry or whatever the kind of more design or perceptual aspect might be regarding stripes of particular proportion. So why stripes?
Well, I tried to say at the beginning from where they come from my way of working, because it's also something general, but something I think basic. It's the fact that nothing came just like that. I mean, many things came by chance, if you want, but nothing come like that, all done, and you can do something with it. In other words, I want to say that it's always a series of jump, a series of contradiction, a series of discussion, etc., which little by little finally maybe made something possible. When I started to work with striped linen, after trying to do something myself with stripes, I was certainly never thinking that I will use such a material for so long. It was out of my mind. Then it was a period, very soon after, as I said, where I systematically repeated the same thing for more than 1 year. And then I quit with that, pardon, and I started to work with paper, like a visual, same stuff. Why the stripes? Because also with these early works, I realized that even that which I took because of its banality and its kind of complete knowledge. Everyone knows stripes, and we see that absolutely everywhere. I realized that it was some visual strong interest in a funny way. For example, you take, let's say, two walls equal, and you get like 200 meters from these walls. And you cover one wall totally with a paper you print red. Then you print a paper with stripe, white and red. From around 100 meters, the one which has 50% less red, with no doubt, you see, oh, this is red. And the one which is completely red, you are not sure if it's brown, if it's red, or if it's dark. So it's a very interesting visual effect that this kind of rhythm give more visuality, which is interesting. Even when I start with that, for me it was because it was only banal and more or less stupid. But it has some strong characteristic. And that's certainly the reason why in the streets everywhere in the world, when they want to take attention of the step or something, they put white and black stripes, for example. The characteristic of my work, it's also the fact that these stripes, which I don't care or less, I can tell you, but I, at one point, decided that they will have always the same measure. And they will never go to adapt themselves to a large wall, a small wall, a tall wall, or a piece of paper. So if I do a work, let's say for a, a magazine, even small like that, I can still put one and maybe to turn. And I can play with it. And if it's a huge wall where I cover everything, which I don't do anymore, but I did that a long time ago. But if I cover this full wall, it will be with the exact same stripes, which I called soon after I started to work with that a visual tool. And I don't want to say too much more about that, but the way I use it, and it's certainly the reason why I can still use it, changed a lot since the beginning. So from something extremely brutal and almost systematic, today I often do it like a little point which help to see something else which has nothing to do with the stripes.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for coming. I have sort of a question that's a follow-up to that, because I'm really interested in the difference between the anonymity initially, but now they become your brand in a way. They're so recognizable, and it feels like that's a very different experience for a viewer, at least someone who's at least informed about your work, that becomes part of it as well. And so it's there for me when I see those stripes in any context, I identify them with you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yes, it's a lot of things about that, because I thought really a lot about even an evident or at least apparent contradiction. It's really started like to be the most, as I said, anonymous possible. I even play at the beginning many times in not using my name at all, like to even not to speak about the street. Of course, my name is nowhere, but to show in a museum, and just the work was there with the restriction of any name in the catalog or in the invitation. Not for personal exhibition, of course, but for inside group show. So I was very attached to this idea, or at least, which is a little stupid, but just to say it, without putting your name, you immediately play with the idea of anonymous. Of course, for me, what is really anonymous, it's the stripes, because they are, as I said again, banal, and they are not signed. No one knows who invents that whatsoever. Now, with the time, certainly I cannot say that. I can say whatever I want, but I cannot say that, and you will laugh if I say no. It's only stripes. It's no one behind, and you don't know even who did it. So I am then confronted with two things. One of the things you said, which I think is very interesting, we cannot understand, we cannot speak, we cannot see anything if we don't have already a very little knowledge of what we are looking at. This is something we all know. I mean, before you understand what is a tree, you cannot recognize a tree. And when we're born, we recognize strictly nothing. And little by little, we built a way to recognize and to then to develop or whatsoever many things. So that's one aspect which I found extremely interesting, because again, someone who never heard or see anything of my work will be exactly like the first person who was able to see the work. Doesn't make any connection, and it's maybe stripes, but stripes about what whatsoever. It's much more difficult to catch with something. The one who know the possibility of the fact the stripes are used by somebody who already did certain works, I remember, make something I think extremely interesting, is to be able to judge what is the difference between what you see right now and what you remember having seen 5 years before. And the stripes then, it's a fantastic economy to try to link together or to jump with very different ideas or very different propositions. Much better, to my way of thinking again, than to follow a work which is, let's say, completely new compared to dozens of work done before. You have to read a paper to see who did that work, and then to relate to this work with other work you maybe know, but only in writing, in reading about this specificity. With the use of the stripes, which become very interesting as a visual tool, this visual tool gives you all the connection possible if you already have the knowledge of that. And then, but this is more a joke, if you take it just only as a signature, I think then we all have big problem with all the painting where we see the signature of the artist. And I think the signature of the artist, who can be as well Picasso or whosoever, I think it's very foreign to the work he is showing. Much more than my stripe within a general work.
On that note, we should finish. Thank you so much.
Thank you.